Marianne offers Earth Care programs for Friends Meeting and groups and is a member of Bellingham Friends Meeting. Take it away, Marianne.
Thank you. Okay, how's the audio?
Excellent.
Is that good? Okay, great. All right. So thank you so much for inviting me, Andrea, and thank you to Friends Meeting of Austin for hosting me today. I'm delighted to be here to share during your forum, and I also come as a member of Quaker Earth Care Witness Steering Committee and the Quaker Earth Care Witness Presents program. So I'm going to start this slideshow. And how's the video? Does that work for you? Everybody can see that? Thumbs up if you can. I think I see thumbs up. Put something in the chat if it doesn't look right to you. Yeah. So Quaker Earth Care Witness is a network of friends, as you may know from Andrea, inspiring spirit-led action for ecological integrity and environmental justice. And I'm only one of about 10 friends in the QEW Speakers Bureau called QEW Presents. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to check out our website and quarterly publication, Befriending Creation. What we hear about Befriending Creation is that friends really love the inspiring stories, including many telling of friends taking spirit-led action on behalf of life on Earth. So I want to let you know that the photos I'll be sharing with you are those I've taken over the years, and this one is from a trail just south of where I live, looking out over the Salish Sea, which many of you may have heard called the Puget Sound. And in the background, the glacier-carved islands the settlers named the San Juan Islands. So I'd like to start with this land acknowledgement that we respectfully acknowledge that this meeting gathers in the traditional sovereign territory of several indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial and continue to do so today. Their presence is imbued in these mountains, valleys, forests, meadows, and waterways. May we honor the original stewards of these places as well as their homelands. So as Andrea mentioned in the introduction, I have long felt a kinship with the living world, something many people call nature. And it's taken me a long time to find the words the living world. I've been looking for words that reflect that I and humans, well, humans, are not separate from the rest of God's creation. And I find that when I take the time to reflect on it, we humans, especially those of the global north, what Joanna Macy calls the Industrial Growth Society, certainly behave as if we're separate. And just when we use the word environmentalism, it's kind of a perpetuation of there's the environment and then there's humans. And I don't really agree with that. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that we're separate from the rest of all that's around us. It's certainly essential to our being. We wouldn't be here without them. Anyway, I can share more about that later, perhaps. Anyway, so during my talk, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be talking with you about how humans, during this difficult time of climate disaster, species extinctions, and what seems like we've been told is the relentless unraveling of the web of life, how we might come to live more peaceably and in greater harmony with our fellow beings and our planet as a whole. And in doing this, I'm going to include 3 ideas central to Friends: our Quaker testimonies, our understanding of continuous revelation, and that expression from George Fox when he said, explained how he knew things. And he said, "This I know experimentally," which we might say is as "this I know experientially." So here we are after 3 years of COVID-induced changes and challenges and isolation, uncertainty, and loss. And at the same time, often greater reliance on and connection with the living world. I don't know how it was there, but I heard locally of so many people discovering hiking and camping and gardening and birding, which they could do despite the COVID-induced isolation. And we find ourselves confronted increasingly with the undeniable reality of our world in crisis. I can tell you that the temperature here today is, we have a heat warning. Now, you're probably going to laugh about that in Austin because it's predicted to be in the 80s, but the temperature this time of year is supposed to top out around 60 degrees. And be raining. And we have no rain in the forecast for the next 10 days. It hasn't rained for about 5. And this is really alarming. But, in addition to the out of control gun violence and other devastating political news, we're experiencing horrific hurricane seasons, fires, 100-year floods, which seem to be taking place with alarming frequency. That's just a few examples. And I imagine that we come bearing the weight, uncertainty, and anxiety of our times. How many of you are feeling worried, distressed, fearful, or despairing about the state of our world? I certainly am. So what do we do? Well, given consideration of the state of the earth and Einstein's insight that we can't solve a problem with the same thinking that got us into it. So we have this worldview that, in my thought, and I'm not the only one, really led to what we're now facing in terms of life on Earth. We can't solve a problem with the same thinking that got us into it. And the way I see things, I really understand climate chaos to be a symptom of a larger and deeper spiritual problem. And that larger problem is how we understand ourselves in and in relationship with the living world, God's creation, the web of life, whatever language works best for you. How do we understand ourselves in and in relationship with the living world? And what are the behaviors that follow naturally from our worldview? So, on the left side of your screen is this pyramidal worldview with humans as the crown of creation. And what seems to have predominated throughout the world is that it's a white male human at the crown of creation. Women are down there with whales, which isn't such a bad place to be. I kind of like hanging out with whales. Anyway. And, the rest of creation is down there below us. And it's there for our use and abuse. We just use what we want, throw it away when we're done, which often doesn't take very long. The image on the right shows us as members of a democracy of species governed by laws of independence. See, the image on the left presupposes that the laws of thermodynamics we're an exception to the laws of thermodynamics. And so, yeah. Clearly, the image on the left is the one that predominates in our world these days and has for many hundreds of years. I really have been working for decades on shifting my paradigm of seeing myself as, and fellow humans, as inextricably interwoven into the fabric of life. So how do we shift our paradigm? How do we change our thinking? How do we get from kind of unconsciously, really unconsciously, I really think that this pyramidal view is so intrinsic in our culture, our language, our institutions, whether they be education, law, politics. They're so intrinsic. How do we shift our paradigm so that we understand ourselves and our place in the universe, or at least our place among the community of life on Earth? Whoops. So Gabe Brown, you may have heard his name. He's the North Dakota farmer, not somebody you would normally think of as a climate activist or an eco-justice warrior. He's the North Dakota farmer and considered a pioneer of the soil health movement. He's been named one of the 25 most influential agricultural leaders in the United States and the author of Dirt to Soil, One Family's Journey into Regenerative Agriculture. And he said, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. Whoops, that's a typo. Which means changing the paradigm, because our paradigm informs our behavior. We can think of many examples of this. If we feel that everyone is equally deserving of justice and being treated with dignity, then our behavior reflects that belief, right? If we believe something else about that, then our behavior will reflect that belief. So how do we change the paradigm? Well, fortunately, long-standing practices which help with this. Of course, many indigenous peoples throughout the world understand the entirety of creation to be their kin, but we don't need to appropriate indigenous practices, for this view is clearly within our Quaker history. William Penn, though now recognized as a slaveholding friend, shared this understanding. And this quotation is from his work, Fruits of Solitude. It would go a great way to caution and direct people in their use of the world that they were better studied and known in the creation of it. For how could we find the confidence to abuse it while we see the great Creator stare us in the face in all and every part thereof? That's my paraphrase. We also find many instances in Scripture. I know some friends find the Bible a great source of wisdom. They consider it their holy book. Other friends, not so much. But for those for whom it's a meaningful source of understanding, perhaps understanding of God's will. For what can be known about God's plan is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal powers and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. I also learned from Thomas Berry, the Passionist priest and self-described geologian, and this was a shock to me, that the early church understood there were two holy books: the written word of the Bible and the created word of God's creation, the living world. And he suggested, this was back in the late 90s when I first met him, he suggested that we put the written word on the shelf for about 1,000 years for affirmative action for the living world. Oops. All right, so we're back to the question, how can we friends begin living into this new paradigm, this different and life-sustaining worldview? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, we're part of a democracy of species and we need each other, and we humans certainly need the rest of the living world. I mean, we wouldn't have oxygen to breathe, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have medicine, we wouldn't have shelter. I mean, you look around and everything in your home or your meeting house or everywhere we go, even cars, you know, come from the living world. So clearly, we need them. But how do we shift our understanding and our relationship with the rest of the community of life on Earth, in which I include the water, the soil, the mountains, rocks, minerals, all those things that people of the Industrial Growth Society call resources, or on a better day, natural resources. Indigenous people call them their relatives. There's truth in that understanding. So I've come to see that friends' testimonies actually might be a doorway to having a different paradigm, or at least a way toward moving into a different paradigm. Our testimonies have long been a guide directing us toward harmonious and reciprocal relationships with other humans. Excuse me. And over the past couple of decades, a number of friends' monthly and yearly meetings have adopted new testimonies along the lines of stewardship or sustainability or unity with nature. So that's the UWN here at the bottom of this slide over here. Does Austin have a Austin or Southern, what is it, South Central yearly meeting have a unity with nature or sustainability queer testimony? Anybody know?
Testimonies, at least in our yearly meeting, and I think in yearly meetings in general, are really observations of the practices of friends. They're not formally adopted, but the yearly meeting does have several formal statements on the on earth care, the state of the environment, and you can find all that stuff at the website scyn.org.
Thank you. All right. So the testimonies is the ones that I've seen in a few faith and practices and websites for yearly meetings are generally considered the spices. And then, as I said, a number of monthly meetings or yearly meetings have included a kind of sustainability testimony. I really see another option, a different approach. When I first found friends, excuse me, now over about 35 years ago, I was delighted to discover the testimonies. This was at another yearly meeting. I wasn't part of North Pacific then. And I thought, wow. And I didn't have this language, but my thinking was along the lines of, wow, these testimonies are a template for living in right relationship with the living world, with creation, with the web of life of which we're a part. But I was disappointed to learn that most friends applied the testimonies only to other humans. It was a wonderful start, I thought, but I believe we need to significantly expand our understanding of how we use and apply those first 5 testimonies, the spices as they're called. I think we need to expand how we use them. And in terms of expanding our understanding, I'm grateful for our tradition of continuous revelation. Excuse me, because our testimonies have been with us for centuries. And they've changed over the centuries. They've changed Barclay to Brinton, Wilmer Cooper, and beyond. The testimonies have been with us and have been evolving as we grow in the light. It's part of that tradition of continuous revelation. When we think about our testimonies, we see that they're relational. And up until now, most friends have understood them as relational, human to human. What does it mean to live in peace or community or equality or integrity or so on with another person, with other people? How do I live with integrity with other people, so on? So today, I'm going to invite us to live into that tradition of continuous revelation and seek to expand our understanding and meaning and application of our testimonies, and seek to understand them in terms of our relationships with other more than human members of God's creation. So I use that expression, and I'm not alone. I think I got it from Robin Wall Kimmerer. More than human. If we say other than human or non-human, it doesn't give as much credence, I feel. I feel like it puts humans back in that hierarchical position. So if I say more than human, clearly other beings have capacities that are far beyond ours. We have capacities that may be beyond theirs, but they have capacities that are far beyond ours. I have a small parrot, and so I learned a lot about the anatomy and physiology of birds, and I learned that birds' voice box, which isn't called a larynx, it's called a spirynx or a spherynx, actually sits at the junction of where the windpipe, the trachea, breaks into two branches. And so birds can make two different sounds simultaneously. I mean, that doesn't necessarily, change my life in a big way, but it's a capacity that I lack. And of course, there are lots of capacities that the living world has that humans don't, like making oxygen, for one thing. Anyway, so I use the term more than human. So my goal is to be able to consider applying the testimonies to more than human beings. And I see that as a way we might likewise expand our understanding of our place in the world and our understanding of our relationship with the rest of the community of life on Earth. So, direct experience. George Fox talked about direct experience as the way he knew things, right? We pay attention to the still small voice. We listen for that voice during meeting for worship, and I hope at other times in my life as well. We're asked to be ever attentive for and faithful to the promptings of the Spirit as we understand the promptings of the Spirit through the still small voice, through an experience of understanding. And of course, we now understand, after the James Naylor experience, that we're asked to test this leading with our community, in the crucible of community. So, if we sit with another being, a more than human being, and consider a testimony in relationship with that being, we might have some insight. We might have an experience that reflects or gives us the opportunity to experience a subtle shift in our understanding. What I'm looking at is the opportunity to open ourselves to continuous revelation, draw on spiritual guidance from the living world, that other holy book, and experience how it would be to extend our testimonies of unity, equality, integrity, community, simplicity, and peace to another being or species, and thereby have the opportunity to witness both in and to the world. We might find that this experience begins a shift in us, a shift in our relationships with the millions of our fellow beings, neighbors, relatives with whom we share planet Earth. And we might consider that this could be a template, or at least a start, for living in right relationship with the living world. So this is the time, in some formats of this program, when I would invite you to experience what I call meeting for worship with a more than human member of the living world. But since your regular Sunday meeting for worship will be starting in about 15 or 20 minutes, I'd like to defer that section a bit and instead invite you to now share your reflections on what you've heard so far. And then, a few minutes before it's time for meeting for worship, consider whether it's pouring rain right there. So going outside isn't really an option. But if you have windows where you're sitting, look out the window and choose or feel yourself chosen by another being and sit with that member of the living world as well as your human friends for the duration of meeting for worship. And perhaps see if there's a testimony that particularly speaks to you. Peace, integrity, community, so on. See what draws your attention in terms of a testimony as well as another being. And then sit with that during the duration of meeting for worship. So I'm also going to post some queries, which I invite you to copy and paste into a document or an email for further reflection later. But for now, I'd love to hear if friends have any thoughts or reflections, comments, or questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And wonder what your thoughts might be. And I thank you. I don't know your name, but the friend who's at the meeting house, please, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Where do I talk? Oh, Mike's around above you there. Okay. So what I was reminded of by your very wonderful presentation, and thank you so much. George Washington Carver went out every morning to read from the book of nature. And he always would put a fresh flower in his buttonhole. That's just what I wanted to share.
Thank you. I didn't miss the name of the person you mentioned.
George Washington Carver.
Can somebody else tell me what name she's saying? Because it's really...
George Washington Carver.
Oh, George Washington Carver. That's great. Thank you. I didn't know that. That's beautiful. And thank you for your kind words.
I don't know if you can see it, Mary Ann, but we have a tree in our meeting room. It
Was
was
that over?
donated to us in a pot. I know what I can't remember what kind of a tree it is. It was a small tree. I mean, but it's a big tree to have in a meeting room. And there was some controversy about it. And the controversy, I like to call it the arboreal heresy. People were concerned they would take a lot of care, the leaves would get everywhere. But ultimately, we decided to care for this tree and keep it in our meeting room. And I'm really glad we did. I consider it a member of the meeting.
It's a ficus.
A ficus? A ficus. A ficus, yeah.
Ficus, yeah. And the tree, of course, is caring for you as well by providing extra oxygen, right? and so many other ways, right? Why is the world so beautiful?
Yeah, I remember when I left the meeting and went to California and I came back, I just remember how big the tree had gotten. I was just like, oh my goodness. You know, if it had been in my house, I would have killed it. I mean, I do great things out in the yard, but I don't do well with house plants. They're they're not supposed to be in the house. They're supposed to be outside, right? But I did just open the door to hear the rain because we have gotten so much rain here in
Wow.
Texas, and and you were like, oh, we don't have any rain, and you're the rainy place, and so I want to remember this rain. I want to remember the joy of getting so much rain and not be like, oh my God, it's like, why do we complain about the weather? It's like, it is, it just is what it is. And yet it affects us so much. It's on our mind. It becomes the big story, when there's nothing else, we make it into this story. And it's interesting because I knew there was this big rain coming, and living in Florida, where you would have the hurricanes, and moving away from Florida, I was like so glad to sort of get away from these hurricanes that hung over you for 6 months out of the year. And I was thinking of, what did people do in a time where there wasn't a weather forecast and we didn't have the internet, we couldn't track weather. And I was thinking of, indigenous people going about their business. And then, I can always smell rain when it's coming. You can but that's when it's upon you, when there's no time to take cover. And how was it that people in a time, maybe not too long ago, managed these natural situations? And they were just the way that you lived in harmony with nature, with natural resources. I love that, what you said about resources, and on a good day, natural resources, but that the indigenous people, it's our relations. These are the people that we live in harmony with. Are they entities? That again, kind of puts them, do we think of ourselves as entities? Probably not. So I like the idea that we think of them as we think of ourselves. They're just in another kind of a form, but they're still, part of the living world. And, I do wish more politicians or, corporate leaders or right-wing conservatives, could see that, could make that part of their own being, to be able to feel the respect within themselves and maybe act differently.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea. I like to tell a story. I live here. I've never lived in a place where the settler community is as integrated with the indigenous peoples as they are here. I live in Bellingham, Washington, which is the far northwest corner of the United States, the continental United States. And the indigenous peoples of this area were never fully removed from these lands. Of course, they had their numbers slaughtered, and their ceremonial objects, their canoes, were burned. Up until very, very recently, just only a few decades ago, were they allowed to practice their ceremonies. Nonetheless, the two communities are pretty. There's still plenty of racism, but they're very visible. And so the Lummi have been fisher folk for since time immemorial, and they hunt to some extent too. But one of their main practices is fishing. And so there are salmon that live in the sea here, and there are orcas who live in the sea. And the resident orcas, as opposed to the transient migratory orcas, the resident orcas are an endangered species. And their primary food source is Chinook salmon, which is also endangered. You may have heard or seen photos or video of the orca about 5 years ago, the female who carried her dead calf on her back for, I think, 17 days. And she was starving. And the calf wasn't able to survive. About a year later, there was another female orca who wasn't eating. And it wasn't understood if she wasn't eating because she wasn't able to find the salmon, or we didn't know. But the Lummi fisher folk decided that they would take salmon out to their relatives. So they caught, they brought a bunch of their catch in their fishing boat out into the water. And like, what do I know? Not a whole lot here. I'm thinking, that's ludicrous. How are they going to find the salmon? I mean, the sea is really big. I mean, the range, even of this resident population, is hundreds, if not more, nautical miles, How are they going to find this starving salmon? Starving orca. So they go out in their fishing boat, and like seemingly within minutes, this female orca who hasn't been eating swims up to their boat. And so the fisher folk, the Lummi, gave this female as much salmon as she wanted, and she swam. And I was just like, wow, I mean, what a lesson in relationship. When your relatives come to your door with food, you open the door, you meet them at the door, it's just what we do. And I mean, that's such an extraordinary example of the power of relationship. I'm always amazed when I read Robin Wall Kimmerer that she is so connected. She so sees the world through such a different lens than I do, even with all my efforts to shift my paradigm. So I've talked enough. I'd love to hear from others.
I just wanted to comment on it's just what we do, because I think that's the essence of testimony. Sometimes testimonies are mistaken for creeds or rules or something that we have to read the testimonies to know how to act. But it's actually the other way around. Testimonies is how we testify to the power of the Spirit in our lives. And sometimes we write that down. We describe what it is that we just do. And that's what testimonies are. Sometimes as a kind of literary or, spiritual practice, I find queries more helpful than testimonies. Like we might have a query that says, in what ways do our lives speak to our understanding of our unity with all of creation or all of nature? And the exploration in the spirit that would proceed from that kind of exercise in a meeting might be profound. It might get written down, and someday somebody might call it a query. Someday somebody might call it a testimony. If in fact we're actually living that belief and not just talking about it.
Thank you. I actually took issue years ago when Pacific Yearly Meeting wanted to add a testimony on, I don't know if they called it sustainability or something. And I said, we're not doing it. I mean, I see them as aspirational, that sometimes I, live in peace with my neighbors, but sometimes I don't. And sometimes, but anyway, I totally hear what you're saying, and I'm going to post the queries, and I hope that I'll screen share them, and I'll put them in the chat as well. And if you want to take a picture of them, if they seem important to you, if you're there in person at the meeting house, you can take a picture of them, or someone can send them. I can put them in an email and send them out to Andrea, and she can send them out, or to Terry, or both of them. I'm going to go to that screen right now. Let's see. And I'll also repeat let me get to this screen. Too many windows open here. Here we go.
If you send stuff to me, I'll get them published. You can send it to fma@austinquakers.org. And that will immediately get my attention.
FMA@austinquakers.
And for starters, you know, I can put material with the video of the session, which I'll
Great.
get
All
up
right.
there sometime next week.
All right. So that's the meeting for worship screen, but here. Cooperate, please. Up. Boop. There we go. All right. So some of these presume that you've already had meeting for worship, but this might be an interesting way to tee up meeting for worship. Just a general reflection on how it felt to share meeting for worship with a more than human member of the living world. What insights you may have derived about your testimony that you chose or that chose you. Consider what being faithful to the testimony in consideration of this being or beings require of me. And then kind of what Terry said, what would my life look like? How am I asked to act? How would my behavior change if I considered and applied the testimonies, all the testimonies, in reciprocity with the living world as I do with human beings? And do I have any sense of an inward shift of my understanding? I hear that happening already. And anything else you'd like to share? So I'm going to put these in the chat. And so remind me, please, of, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. You have 15 minutes now before 13, before worship, where you do something else. Is that right?
Well, we usually close with some silence and then leave 5 or 10 minutes just to shift gears from forum to meeting for worship. There was, you sent a link for registration, and I was a little confused about what that was about. Is there any reason for friends to, register? Will there be follow-up that you'd like their emails for? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I shall put that in the chat, and I have some flyers which I will leave out so people can have that. Okay?
So you're going to put a link to registration in the chat?
I'm going to put a link to the page on the QEW website that you sent,
Okay.
which has a registration button.
Yeah, Terry, I registered just because I wanted to check out the link, but if anybody at the meeting house wants to register, they can post-register.
Or should they just send Mary Ann or email or something like that?
No,
I wasn't sure about what
really
kind of
goes to
follow-up they had
Shelley.
in mind.
No, they should really just, it doesn't matter. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It's not the way we do our forum. And Shelley said, that's fine. It just kind of, they want to know, like, how many people were there. And I see there's about 5 or 6 people in the meeting house and me and Terry. So I can also just report back, I think. And I imagine that everybody in the meeting house already gets creation. That would be another way for people to be able to get that newsletter. So
okay.
All right. So fine if we want to close with some worship and then transition. I'm going to screen share the queries. And we can close with some worship.
I want to thank Mary Ann again for showing up early on a Sunday, and happy Mom's Day to everybody else out there. And Mother Earth.